and I call the member for Durack.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I rise to speak on the government's package of bills regarding agriculture biosecurity protection levies. Mr Deputy Speaker, I'd like to begin my contribution to this debate by acknowledging the importance of maintaining a strong and robust biosecurity system. Ensuring we are protected from exotic pests and diseases, of course, is critical to the preservation and future of local food production, and I'm sure that Australia's 85,000 farmers would agree. Recent events surrounding the threat of foot and mouth disease, so close to our own borders, have highlighted how we must remain ever vigilant to this threat. However, it must be said that the approach that's outlined in this package of bills before us today is absurd and completely unfair. The so-called Biosecurity Protection Levy will charge Australian primary producers $50 million per year to pay for the biosecurity costs of importers. Under this legislation, farmers and fishers from my electorate will be forced to cover the risks associated to foreign competitors. How ridiculous. So just let's reflect on that proposition for a second. Australian producers, already struggling with the cost of living crisis and staffing shortages and issues relating to natural disaster, will be burdened with further fees in order to ensure that their competitors' produce does not present a biosecurity threat. It sounds like a joke. It sounds like someone's just sort of made it up. Well, why should it be the responsibility of grain growers in the wheat belt, in my electorate of Durack, or my cattle producers in the wonderful region of the Gascoyne, or the cray fishermen in the Midwest to fund this process? This is just another stab in the guts for struggling producers and will no doubt adversely affect West Australian producers. This bill is just the latest attack on WA farmers by this Labor government. So again, I call on the Minister for Agriculture to release the live sheep export report that has been sitting on his desk since October, sitting on his desk, probably at the bottom of a very, very large in-tray, collecting dust. That trade is fundamental to the lives and livelihoods of so many Western Australian communities, and at the very least they deserve answers and some honesty from this government about what are their plans with this industry. The arguments to abolish the live sheep trade are not based in fact. And I believe this decision, if indeed there is a decision, but we don't know because the report's at the bottom of the in-tray, is simply a method to win metropolitan seats from the Greens political party. And it is nothing to do with animal health, and it's all to do with politics. Shameful. It's worth noting that just like their decision to end the live sheep trade, the introduction of the biosecurity levy is also pretty well universally opposed by producers around Australia. The Albanese government has failed once again to have a legitimate consultation process that takes the concerns of farmers, our Australian farmers and primary producers, into consideration. In fact, over 50 industry organisations, many of whom represent farmers and producers in my electorate of Durack, have written to the government calling on them to axe this tax and to take a different approach. This morning I had the wonderful pleasure of catching up with Colin and Duncan and Barry from Grain Producers Australia, and I'd like to thank them for their leadership, for their strong leadership and for standing up for Australian farmers. I must say that their frustration with this new tax was palpable. Barry Large, who is the chair of the GPA and is a WA grain farmer from Miling in my electorate of Durack. Barry has pointed out that the Australian producers already pay hundreds of millions of dollars each year in various levies. They're already doing this. And we want to do a little bit more. And what they're doing is that they're already delivering many public benefits, including opportunities for more research and also environmental gains. Adding to the frustration of the agricultural sector is the staggering lack of detail. These bills fail to outline exactly who will be paying the levy and only mentions certain producers. This basic detail is expected to be set out in regulations and will likely cover farmers, fishers and foresters. Also missing is how much producers will be charged or how the levy will be collected. Incredibly, from all accounts that we've heard, the money that will get raised through this levy might not even contribute to strengthening our biosecurity system and will instead just be dumped in consolidated revenue. Honestly, Mr Deputy Speaker, you cannot make this stuff up. If passed, these reforms are set to apply from July 1. That's July 1 this year, just a couple of months away. That is just 3 short months away, yet so many important questions remained unanswered. This is despite the policy being announced in May 2023. The incompetence of this Labor government is, quite frankly, next level. And this is just the latest example of this government making policy on the run and failing to properly consult with regional Australia. And it's not just industry and the coalition who are against this bill. 2 independent reviews conducted by the Productivity Commission and the Australian National University have found it is very flawed policy indeed. And it's no wonder why, as another important consideration, is that the cost of this levy will inevitably be passed on to consumers. As if the Australian public weren't doing it tough enough as it is, the government's going to make it harder, not easier for them to put food on the table. This levy will drive up prices at the supermarket when Australians can least afford it. Through this legislation, Labor are essentially introducing a fresh food tax on Australian produce. So it's worth noting, I think even those opposite understand that this legislation is a dud, Deputy Speaker. Last I checked, there were more than 20 members from our side, from the coalition side, who were listed to speak on this debate. Of all the speakers in this debate, let me tell you, public, there was only one person that had their name down from the Labor government, from those people who are creating this legislation that intend to speak, whether they have or not, I'm unsure. Only one. And when I informed my visitors from the Grain Producers Australia about this, they weren't surprised to hear that, but let me tell you, they were very, very disappointed. So I must ask, if this is such a good piece of legislation that's backed by the government, where are all the Labor members of Parliament that are lining up here to talk about this fabulous legislation? Where are they? Particularly the ones who are from regional Australia, or those who say that they care deeply about regional Australia. Where are they? Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, they're not here. They're not here. Why aren't they lining up here to defend this ridiculous, useless piece of legislation? What their silence represents is their contempt, or at least apathy, for regional Australia. They were all too eager recently to speak about the so-called cost of living tax cuts only a couple of weeks ago, and to pretend that an extra $15 is going to make a significant difference. Well, the inflationary measures like this won't make that $15 go very far at all. If this bill is passed, Australian families are going to have to pay more for local meat, seafood, fruit and veggies in order to subsidise produce from overseas. Time and time again, Labor are responsible for implementing policies that drive inflation further and prolongs this cost of living crisis. I don't know how long the Prime Minister and the Treasurer are going to continue to point the finger at somebody else when this is a crisis that they are responsible for. In my conversations across Durack, I think regional Western Australians, well, guess what? They've woken up to this fact, and I'm sure people in Perth and other capital cities are also starting to as well. Unfortunately, Labor does have the numbers in this bill, and soon when we leave the Federation Chamber and head back to the main chamber, I'm sure every single one of these Labor politicians who say that they care about regional Australia, they're all going to line up and they're going to support this legislation. Well, they should hang their heads in shame. For those listening at home, that legislation will then make its way to the Senate, and I call on the Senate crossbench to ensure that, given the multitude of issues with this legislation, please do your homework, understand what this will do to regional communities, and make sure this useless piece of legislation, this package of legislation, receives proper scrutiny before a committee. This should not be rushed through to meet the deadline of the 1st of July. Without all these answers being resolved, at the very least, maybe we might actually get rid of this useless piece of legislation. So I want to conclude by returning to the point I made at the start of my contribution. We do need a strong biosecurity system, and on this side of the House we have a plan that is reasonable, makes sense and is supported by industry and independent review. Our approach is targeted at the risk creators, not our local Australian producers. When we return to the government, which will be very soon, I'm sure, Deputy Speaker, after the next election, we will introduce an importer container levy, which will see the importers, yes, the importers, the people who are creating the risk, for them to pay to cover the costs of our biosecurity system. Applying a charge on containerised cargo coming into Australia will mean local farmers are not punished for the biosecurity risks that others create. This was an important recommendation included in the independent Craig Biosecurity Review and has unfortunately been rejected by this hapless government. If producers overseas want to sell their product in Australia, that's fine. That's the way international trade and markets work. But we shouldn't punish Australian farmers to enable this. If they want to sell their product in Australia, they should be the ones paying to ensure it is okay and does not present a risk. Those opposite have been reflecting on the fact that the coalition has been the party of no. They've talked about it a lot. Well, the fact is when you put up rubbish legislation like this that is almost universally opposed by stakeholders and favours international competitors over local producers and leaves all of the important questions unanswered, of course we are going to say no. You give us no choice but to reject this useless piece of legislation. Of course we're going to say no to yet another attack on regional Australia, and this government seems hell-bent on pursuing. But we aren't just saying no, we have offered an alternative that I sincerely hope those opposite take up. An alternative that would be welcomed by Australian producers, but also consumers who want to continue to enjoy local Australian produce. I'm tired of hearing from farmers right across my electorate who are already struggling under this government. Right now, they need help, not another Labor policy that makes things even worse. I will not be supporting this package of legislation and call on the Minister for Agriculture to do his job and to put Australian farmers first for a change. It's time to reverse course and to scrap this tax.